Alright folks, today I'm here to bring you through the first volume of the Walking Dead comics and the history of how the series came to be. It's no secret I have a habit of covering story arcs out of order from this franchise, so I figured I should probably break that trend and start from the beginning. If you're enjoying this type of content, be sure to hit that like button and drop a sub to see more videos like this. Our story begins in the early 2000s as a young comic book writer named Robert Kirkman and artist Tony Moore would begin developing a story based around Kirkman's childhood passion: zombies. After Image Comics turned down their original pitch for a futuristic zombie story titled Dead Planet, Kirkman and Moore were determined to get their concept right, stepping back and taking a more traditional approach to the genre. The first iteration of The Walking Dead was conceptualized as a sequel to George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, taking place in the 1960s. We can see this on display as Tony Moore's first sketch for the story's initial pitch depicted the same newscaster from the classic horror film. Although Night of the Living Dead was in public domain due to a mess-up with distributors, Jim Valentino, publisher of Image Comics, suggested Kirkman use an original concept to help it stand on its own 2 feet. The version of the original 5-page pitch Kirkman released years later would see the direct references to Night of the Living Dead toned down, but it's clearly inspiration was still there. The pitch begins with a totally different newscaster explaining the dead have begun to walk the earth and this could be the end of the world as they know it. Rick would just roll his eyes, telling his wife, Carol, this was just another Orson Welles War of the Worlds scenario and there was nothing to worry about. Yeah, apparently Laurie's original name was Carol. I read somewhere it might have been changed because Carol and Carl sounded too similar, but that's not confirmed. But as the two argue on the legitimacy of what the anchor said, they hear a consistent thudding sound coming from the front door. Begging her husband not to open it, Rick would turn the handle and naturally would be attacked by a roamer. Kirkman himself wasn't a huge fan of this concept, however, describing it as terribly cliche, and others at Image Comics would agree. So he and Tony went back to the drawing board, coming up with a new revised concept for the series that we know and love today. But Image Comics still didn't want it, claiming it was now too normal.
Yeah, I don't know, man. There's just no real hook.
Aliens.
What?
The zombies were sent by aliens. That's right. Kirkman had to tell a little white lie, claiming the big revelation of the series would see an alien invasion take center stage. Obviously, this was never the intention, but it was enough for Image Comics to greenlight The Walking Dead, and by 2003, they were off to the races. If you've seen my other comic videos, one thing you're probably going to notice right away is the different art style. As mentioned, Tony Moore was the original artist for the series, illustrating the first 6 issues. But when the ball got rolling, he would struggle to keep up with the tight deadlines, electing to step back and just focus on covers for the next few volumes, before moving on to other projects, while Charlie Adlard eventually took the reins as the full-time artist. But with all that background information out of the way, let's take a look at what the first installment of The Walking Dead looks like. Volume 1, Days Gone By, wastes no time jumping into the action, as we pick up in the middle of a police shootout pre-apocalypse. Officers Rick Grimes and Shane Walsh cover behind a car as Rick decides to make a run for the ditch to surround the escaped convicts. But as we know all too well, Rick would be hit in the line of fire, barely 6 panels in. Waking up in the hospital, dehydrated and weak, Rick would call out for a nurse, but nobody would come. Getting dressed and making his way down the halls, he would realize the hospital was silent and still. The only sound to be heard was the shuffling of his own feet. Arriving at the elevator and opening the door, Rick would be shocked to see a decomposing corpse fall to his feet. He would scream for help, but again, nobody was there. Well, except for the cafeteria, that Rick would discover had been boarded up to trap a whole lot of sick people inside. Lunging out, Rick would tumble down the stairs along with one of the infected, crushing its skull in the fall before making his escape. But it wouldn't really be much of an escape at all, as he would quickly discover whatever was going on here was not confined to the hospital. It was everywhere. Lawns remained uncut and garbage blew across the streets. Something really bad happened while Rick was in a coma, and that would become even more apparent as a half-eaten corpse would begin wheezing and staring at the ex-police deputy. It was clear now, something else was going on here. These people weren't sick. No living person would be able to move after that. So much suffering and death had occurred, but he missed it all. And from what he could tell, no help was coming. Rick would stop into what was once his home, where it lies ransacked with no signs of his wife Lori or son Carl. Hopelessly wandering around the neighborhood praying for a sign or a clue, Rick would suddenly be smacked in the head with a shovel. A man and his son stood over him as he drifted in and out of consciousness, waking up in the stranger's home under their care. The man introduces himself as Morgan Jones, and the boy who smacked him was his son Dwayne, who had mistook him for one of the roamers. Looking at him like he was crazy, Rick would explain he had been in a coma for the last month and had absolutely no clue what was going on. Morgan would fill him in on what he missed, describing how quickly everything went to shit. One day, everyone was walking their dogs and heading to work. The next, chaos. The media had no idea what was going on either, telling the scared population to relocate to the big cities as they would be easier for the military to protect. The only thing they did know was not to get bit or scratched by one of those things, as that's how whatever this was spread. Days later, the power grid would go down, leaving them in the dark ever since. Morgan would decide to take his chances along with his son in a small town, but if Rick's family were still alive, they would more than likely be in Atlanta. Stopping into the old police station, Rick would load up a bag of guns and ammo while setting Morgan up to defend his son. Rick has his destination, but Morgan still believes small towns are safer, electing to stay behind. But before parting ways, they would be interrupted by a roamer trapped behind a fence. Although Rick knew to aim for the head, Morgan reminds him that bullet will be needed for later, and noise is what attracts them. Setting off, Rick asks Morgan to watch his house for when he gets back, but on his way out, the ex-deputy makes sure to stop by the roamer who was left suffering and puts her down, representing the acceptance of having to get his hands dirty in this world in order to find his family, but also the sadness of the situation he finds himself in. Rick's journey to Atlanta would be relatively quiet, but before long his car would run out of gas. Coming across a farmhouse, he would discover the true horrors of this new world, as bodies from a murder-suicide lied on the floor. Some couldn't handle the weight of the new world, but Rick knew his family was out there somewhere and had to keep going. The farm had no gas, but it did have a horse that Rick would ride for the rest of his journey to the big city. But when arriving, he didn't see the military patrolling the streets. Instead, he is greeted by a horde of roamers. Rick would barely slip away from the pileup, but loses the poor horse he took away from his home. He surely would have died right there in the street if it wasn't for Glenn Rhee, who would lie down some cover fire and rescue Rick from certain death, all out of the goodness of his own heart. Expressing his gratitude, Rick follows Glenn to his camp on the outskirts of the city, asking where all the survivors had gone. Here, Glenn tells the naive deputy that was them trying to eat him back there. A handful of them had made it out at the beginning and set up camp, but that was about it. All congregating in the cities did was put all the food in one place, and the authorities had failed to protect them. Rick would fear his family was among the dead, but as the two approached Glenn's camp, those fears would be put to rest, as both Carl and Lori run to him, screaming his name, embracing the father and husband they believed to be dead. Holding his family tight, Rick would be approached by a familiar face, Shane, his partner and best friend who led Carl and Lori away from the city when everything went down. as a sort of way to apologize for letting Rick get shot, in his words. This was the best case scenario Rick could have asked for. He had found his family against all odds, and his best friend too. Following the reunion, Rick would be introduced to those around the camp. Some you may be familiar with if you've seen the show adaptation, such as Andrea, her sister Amy, Carol, Sophia, Dale, and Jim. But also a few faces you may not be familiar with, such as Alan, Donna, and their twin sons Ben and Billy. Okay, they were actually adapted into the show in season 3, but their story's pretty different. Who really remembers these guys anyway? Actually, Ben was technically adapted twice, with Lizzie in season 4, but that doesn't really matter. That night, Rick would tell the camp of what it was like to wake up alone in the hospital, but none of that mattered now. He found his family and he was gonna sleep well. The next morning, Rick would get adjusted to life at the camp, but Dale would pull him aside to let him know, despite their history, Shane doesn't seem happy Rick is back, and that he wouldn't trust him around his wife. Rick would initially blow off Dale's warning, but he should have known no stranger would let someone know that without any merit. Later, while out hunting, the partners would come across a single roamer gnawing on a deer. Initially, it wouldn't attack them as it was preoccupied, but the same couldn't be said back at the camp, as Dale would be forced to cut another roamer's head clean off. There was no debate, they weren't just sick people after this point, as the severed head would begin gnawing at them from the ground. Everyone would survive this scare, but it would serve as a foreboding sign for the camp's future. Rick would hold his family tight, fearing having lost them once again, but from a distance, Shane would stare at the happy family with a disgusted look on his face that spoke 1,000 words. Maybe Dale's comments earlier were warranted after all. But later that night, Rick would approach his partner with the proposition of moving to someplace safer, which Shane would outright refuse, still believing the government was on their way to clean this mess up, and they just needed to sit tight. Rick disagrees, but trusts his friend, letting him know if they were staying, he was gonna head back into the city for more weapons and ammo. Which is exactly what he would do the next day with Glenn by his side, as he knows the routes in and out better than anyone. Here, Rick has the thought that the only way the dead would be able to differentiate themselves from the living was by the smell. So reluctantly, the two find the nearest corpse and coat themselves from head to toe in its guts. Turns out, Rick was right. The duo are able to move throughout the rotting streets unharmed and unnoticed, reaching their destination. But after acquiring the weapons, Rick and Glenn would run into a bit of an issue. Rain begins pouring, washing away the smell, leaving the two fighting for their lives in the streets. It was an extremely close call with Rick nearly getting bit, but luckily the two make it out unscathed. However, back at the camp, Lori stands in the downpour awaiting her husband's return as Shane approaches, comforting her a little too much. She would push him away, but here we get the totally unforeseen bombshell that the two had hooked up while escaping Atlanta, and Shane was having a hard time letting go of what they had. All Lori could say was that it was just a mistake, leaving Shane to bottle up his jealousy and resentment, as to him, Rick had come back just to take everything he gained at the end of the world away. The next day, after returning from the city, Rick and Shane would give shooting lessons to the rest of the group with their newly acquired guns and ammo, including the young Carl, who Lori believes is way too young to have a gun and wouldn't understand the power in his hands. But Rick knows this is a dangerous world. He was gonna have to learn eventually. Later on in the woods, the topic of moving camp comes up in conversation once again, as the weather is turning cold and snow is beginning to fall. But again, Shane snaps, refusing to even hear the sentiment, as in his eyes, this was the best place for them to be, despite the increasing frequency of roamer sightings. The cold would have the group gathering around the campfire that night for warmth, as our survivors take turns telling the stories of how they got to where they are now. The first weeks were so horrific that no matter who was speaking, the mood was somber. Amy, wanting to get away from the tension, boldly announces she has to pee and makes her way to the trailer. But in The Walking Dead's first truly shocking moment, she is bitten right on the neck by a passing roamer, accompanied by an entire pack on its tail. One thing I wanted to mention, the mobile game The Walking Dead Assault actually points out that this walker was the same man who shot Rick at the beginning. But the canonicity of mobile games is heavily debatable. And taking a closer look, the walker had all his front teeth while the shooter did not. So, I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments. Amy falls to the ground, choking on blood as our group panics, frantically firing their guns while Andrea cries over her sister's dying body, before putting her down to prevent reanimation. The survivors would be successful in clearing the dead, but Amy wouldn't be the only victim in this attack, as Jim reveals he had been bit on the arm in the chaos. The next morning, the survivors gather around the newly dug grave and pay their respects, as Jim's infection begins to take over. Morale was extremely low and food was running scarce, so Rick, Carl, and Shane would go out to hunt. Carl makes a comment about having less mouths to feed, which sets something off within Shane, screaming to Rick that this wasn't his fault, and staying at the camp was still the right move as they would be lost out in the wasteland. But Rick fights back, making it clear he believes this will only continue to happen if they don't do something about it. They were too close to the city, and sooner or later another pack was gonna come by, which scares Carl into running away crying. The debate would be put on hold for now, but Shane wasn't going to let this go, believing the real problem within their group was actually Rick. Back at the camp, Jim has reached the end of his fight. Having lost his family to roamers early on, his last wish was to be left to turn, so maybe one day he would be able to walk with them again. Obliging his request, our group would say their goodbyes and leave the man to rest. The next morning, Rick wakes up preparing to go on another hunt with Shane, but after letting him know they had some serious shit to sort out, Shane swings on Rick, screaming Jim and Amy weren't his fault once again. But as Lori defends her husband, calling him a lunatic, Shane takes a look around, realizing the entire camp was looking at him like he was the monster, and storms off into the woods. Following close behind, Rick would demand Shane stops, but the man who was once his best friend and partner snaps, pulling his shotgun out with tears flowing down his face. Here, Shane tells Rick exactly how he feels, how he has nothing in this world, no friends, no family, and now no respect either. He had believed Lori would eventually come around to loving him the way he loved her, but when Rick came back, that all fell apart for him. Before, people looked to him as a leader, but now Rick had taken that away too. It's unclear exactly what his plan was if he were to kill Rick here, but it wouldn't matter, as Shane would be shot through the neck before making his choice. And on the other end of that bullet was Carl, screaming at Shane not to hurt his dad again. The troubled cop would fall to his knees, choking on his own blood as Carl, with tears in his eyes, runs over to hug his father, telling him it wasn't the same as killing the dead ones. Holding him tight, all Rick could say was it never should be, realizing the toll this horrific world was taking on his family. And that, folks, is the entire first volume of The Walking Dead comics explained. This is one of the story arcs where I definitely prefer the show version, as at times the comic can feel like it's moving at a breakneck pace. This pretty much just boils down to Shane. Their confrontation at the end feels really weird and underdeveloped, especially when you compare it to the show. Shane and Lori were never in a full-on relationship in the comics, simply a one-night stand told to us through flashbacks after the fact. So the emotional connection for me just isn't there to warrant Shane wanting Rick dead. Rick is completely unaware anything even happened between the two, so when Shane pulls his gun out, Rick is just confused more than anything. I don't mind Carl shooting him either, but I think it just holds more weight for Rick to do it himself, like in the adaptation. Carl gets a similar moment later on in the Fear the Hunter story arc that I think is way more effective. One thing that would be difficult not to bring up are the similarities between the first issue and 28 Days Later. Kirkman claims the whole waking up from a coma thing was purely a coincidence. By the time the film came out, he had already been working on issue 2, so instead of rewriting the first one, he made the choice to just go with it anyway. Is this true? I have no idea. Kirkman has always liked to troll, but he's not an outright liar. Coincidences do happen, but the similarities are pretty undeniable, so it's to your own discretion. But that's gonna do it for me today, folks. Let me know in the comments your thoughts on the beginning of the comics and what you like or dislike compared to the show. Thanks so much for watching.